health, I've got a long history of personal lived experience, and I think that really inspired my want to get involved within like the mental health kind of sector space. I struggled a lot when I was younger, as a lot of people do, and during my own mental health journey, I came across National Mind, and my first ever youth voice role was with National Mind as part of their 2021 to 2024 strategy. I was part of their youth voice advisory group or advisory panel. I can't remember what they called it at the time. So that was kind of the first thing I ever did. I got poorly when I was 15, majorly. I kind of struggled all my life, and I ended up spending 5 years in inpatient hospital, and I couldn't get myself out. I think it was really hard. I think there's a lot of, I think probably we'll get into later on, but that kind of really tricky thing of when, especially for young people who kind of get stuck in the hospital kind of part, there isn't that, it's hard to then get out when you're kind of go in as a child, come out as an adult. What is there? How do you kind of navigate this whole life thing? And I found a youth voice advisory. I joined, and it just gave me this bug for oh my goodness, all of the horrible things that have happened, and not that they are ever justified or it's ever worth that thing happening, but it was the power and the voice it gave me to kind of get involved and be able to be part of making change was really important, and it really improved my own well-being, my own mental health, and hopefully in the process helps other people as well. I think co-production is not just important, I think it's essential, it's vital, it's the most important thing. As somebody who spent a very long time in mental health services, I actually had my appointment with my psychiatrist, my last appointment with my psychiatrist yesterday over the phone, from where I've just moved to London. And I said that was with adult services, and that was 8 years. I've been with adult services for 8 years, and it was that crazy realization of how long I'd been stuck in this system. And actually, this is not anything against mental health services, but so much of the biggest work that happened, I did myself, because actually there's a lot to be said about, symptom reduction, and that's the illness side of kind of mental illness. But when it comes to sustained recovery and mental health and mental well-being, actually there's a lot of things that we have to do that aren't medical to kind of keep that kind of well-being side. And often a lot of the services that I've come into contact with, due to many, many reasons, and we won't get into all of those because, it's not too political, in January, but there isn't that, tailored kind of, and for me, peer support is so vital. And actually, as young people, or as anybody, we know ourselves best. So people who struggle with mental health, we know ourselves and how our brains work the best. So being able to be involved is not only empowering, not only does it mean that you actually are dealing with the right thing and what people are looking for, but also it gives that autonomy back to the person to be able to feel like, actually, I have a worth and I have a place, and I can be part of, channeling what feels right for me and my community. Okay, so it's just a tricky one. I kind of have I separate it into three: mental illness, mental well-being, and mental health in the middle. I view mental health in terms of the really cringy and cliche phrase, which I've always vowed never to be that person, but here I am sat here, that, we all have mental health, absolutely. And it's to define mental health, I view it as in comparison to physical health, say, illnesses, say that, you might go cancer or, a long-term heart condition, they're your mental illness side. And then mental health, people, when you get the flu, it's something that, can be really debilitating, your mental health, struggling with it, but it isn't necessarily something that's needs medical intervention, which is in terms of mental illness. I'm really explaining this so badly, but sometimes you might need medical intervention. But you know what? Let's go into welcome to Hannah ADHD and an inability to, it's authentic, although that was my New Year's intention, to be authentically me. So it's just going to be what's happening. Okay. I found about mental fitness. That was very interesting. Scene. How do I explain mental health? because the terms get so confused, I think and that's not to invalidate. I think there is definitely a thing of like, there isn't hierarchy, and that's something that really frustrates me when we look at like, because obviously a lot of services and things due to capacity, you have to hit a certain threshold, and that shouldn't, but not hitting that threshold doesn't invalidate the pain and the struggle that you're going through. And I think when I think of like mental health and like the well-being part, I know I used to feel invalidated by kind of when people would give advice that would like be more mental well-being side, and I'd be like, that doesn't help, you don't understand. But actually, as I've kind of gone through things, I've now realised actually a lot of that advice that I thought was really, really rubbish actually fits in a different part of the picture. And actually that's what understanding the nuances between all of the different things and not feeling like my validity or my pain has to be comparable to other people's has really helped like me understand that. But that doesn't explain what mental health is. Massively. I think the thing with mental health, and obviously it's a big topic of conversation these days, which is amazing because obviously, I'm not that old, but I know that it's, even since when and I really am not that old. I'm not going to sit here and claim, like, when people are like, oh my gosh, it's so rude, like, I'm in my early to mid 20s. Like, when I say that, I'm like, oh gosh, it really has. When I was 16 in school, it's crazy how, like, mental health wasn't spoken about anywhere near as much as, like, even my friends or my cousins who are now, like, so they're 20, so they're, like, 3-4 years younger than me. When they were in secondary school, it was spoken about even more than when I was, like, and just in those few years, kind of the change has massively switched, I feel like, into more of a, when I first struggled, I ended up, actually, I didn't even really know about mental health until I was sat in a hospital bed. Like, I knew of mental health, obviously, but I didn't know about the whole world of mental health, mental illness, inpatient sections, all of that. I had no idea, and I was sat in a hospital bed, and it all learned pretty quick. Learn on the job, learn there and then. But it's interesting how, and then obviously you go through a lot, and I think there's so many narratives, especially for young people, around, this self-help and this mindfulness and all of these things, and it can feel really invalidating in the moment. Like, when you're in this crisis, it's like, what are you telling me, that I need to go and have a bath, or I need to rub an ice cube on my nose? Like, do you not understand how much I'm suffering and like how much I'm really struggling? And for so long, like, it used to really drive me nuts. Like, I used to like get proper angry when I would be suggested those things. And, unfortunately for me, I got very much stuck in the system and became very, very poorly, and kind of a long time in hospital. And even when I got out of hospital, it was still a lot of really big crises that weren't being averted, shall we say, for better, I don't think that's the right word, well, from a lack of a better word. And actually, even then, people would bang on about, these like crisis plans, like these kind of things that I felt didn't work in the moment. And what I kind of learnt for me, and again, this worked for me, it might not work for anybody else, was actually those things like, being mindful, having a bath, doing self-care. Those are things I need to do every single day of my life, that actually, to avert the crisis, it isn't in the moment when I get to that really bubbling up emotion part, that they don't work for me in that moment. But actually, there is a lot to be said about those things for me, just in absolutely every single everyday life. And I think also learning, my biggest probably mental health, like the catalyst that really helped me change after being stuck so long, like in this like kind of shrinking world of like doom, was finding out that I'm neurodivergent, so I'm autistic and ADHD, hence the little squidgy. And that was massive, because it was like, I didn't have the overnight moment. I wasn't that person who was like, oh my gosh, finding out that I'm autistic, that's changed my whole life. Actually, initially I was like, no, I'm not. My sibling, who's assigned male at birth, is autistic. And I was like, I'm not like that. Like, I couldn't understand. And obviously then went through my own internalized ableism and like learning about what it actually means, and the fact that actually neurodivergence is still so misunderstood, and actually there's so many nuances and so individual. And then it was that kind of own journey of like self-discovery. Probably the worst bit of advice that I've ever been given in kind of any of my journey, which is a long journey, and actually, like, for me, the nuance does also come with the fact that I have had very bad experiences with services, and now have complex PTSD for many different reasons, but part of it was bad mistreatment within, especially within inpatient hospital. So, like, forgetting the obvious kind of bits of advice that were not helpful, I think the idea that, and I suppose this is actually not necessarily, I think this is probably an autistic thing of taking it very literally what this person, what someone was saying, but that I think the idea that I was recovering into something else, I think that, like, I was, not even that happiness was a destination, but like that, you know, that recovery and, like, be feeling better meant that I would never have any really, really negative thoughts again. And, like, that's obviously, and I actually did a podcast about this on my podcast the other day, which was, like, a really tricky, nuanced, like, I'm gonna, like, you can look at me like, stop talking. But in terms of, like, especially in relation to suicidal thoughts, and I think for so long, as soon as a thought would come in, I would panic that I'd completely gone back. And actually what I've learned is that I can sit and be completely safe, and that, yes, my brain may have moments of, like, oh my goodness, this world is, like, too much for me to cope with, but I know deep down that will go away. And I think for so long I thought that those really horrible moments would never happen again, and so every time they did, I was like, no, that means that I've not got any better, that I'm back to square one. And actually, what I learned for me, and it's obviously very individual, that actually that was really holding me back, because I was kind of almost giving up every time and thinking that I was like failing at, like, getting better. But actually, I wasn't. That when people had said that, you know, you would not feel these feelings anymore, that was, you know, if you get to that point where that doesn't necessarily mean they're gone forever, but that it just means that you kind of grow around it and you have a life around it. And, like, although there's still that pain might come, and for me, like, when it comes, it's still just as strong as it was before, but actually luckily, you know, the more you build a life, the frequency is less, even if the pain is still as strong when it does come. But actually, it's not getting rid of that pain. That's not what recovery looks like, or didn't for me. It was actually building a life around that and having great moments that made, when it is a bit tricky, okay, because I know what I have to do in those moments, and actually it's not wrong to have those feelings. Obviously it's not nice and horrible, and no one deserves those feelings. I don't deserve those feelings. And obviously, you know, in an ideal world you wouldn't have those feelings, but we don't live in an ideal world. But actually, it's not necessarily that you're going to fully remove them. And I think that was that thing that I was always working for this. Not that I thought I was going to be happy every day, because, you know, I'm very aware that, like, we have emotions and everyone feels sad and angry and all of the emotions in the world. But I think that really horrendous dark place that sometimes, but it's so nuanced, I think it's really hard. But, like, that thing of, like, if I ever feel, I would think that it was all over, and actually I've learned that although it still feels horrible in those moments, it's like, it is riding that wave, and actually the less I fight it, the less, if I just sit, it's hard. Like, and I don't obviously just sit, because that doesn't really work. That actually does get better. Like, it does. And you wake up in the morning, and, like, my mum said this, and this was actually so frustrating, because she was right. And, like, oh my goodness, when someone is right, and I'm determined that I'm always right, you know, when I have those, especially at night, I think obviously we can all relate to the nighttime struggles, I'd have, like, it's never going to get any better, you don't understand. And she'd be like, go to sleep, because in the morning it will feel even just 1% better, and insistent that it wouldn't. And obviously, you know, in the past, maybe that would have escalated. Now, if I do go to sleep, however rubbish I feel, it does feel better in the morning. And then she also tells me I'm not allowed to make any decisions after 6 p.m. And it is that frustrating thing, because you're like, that feels so basic. But actually, when you're in that negative spiral, waving it out does actually work. I think the best piece of advice, well, there's two. The first one, I'll say, I'll just cut it out because it might not be very appropriate, but I'll say it anyway because, safe space, that's where we are. I think one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got was, why, this is really, when you're just like, I know what I'm going to say, but why kill yourself now? Because you can always do it later, see what happens in the meantime. And although that sounds like the most ridiculous bit of advice ever given to a human being, actually that has saved my life so many times, because sometimes when it all feels like, oh my goodness, I can't, and this world is so, and what about all these things? In that moment of when that feels like that, if I tell myself, just go through it for now because you can always do it later, and then obviously I feel better in the morning or the next day, and then so that is a bit of advice that I has, but again, it's not necessarily a very PG bit of advice to go around giving people, and obviously get help. But the other probably bit of advice, which again isn't actually advice, this is the thing that's driven me every single day since, and is what kind of is the fire in my belly. And when things do get hard and get tough, it's not really advice, it's a statement that I kind of have in my head of prove them wrong. And I think for someone who grew up in situations of a lot of trauma and abuse and things like that, and constantly been told my whole life that I will never achieve, that's the only narrative I've ever really heard, apart from my mum. And I think I remember when I used to go into hospital, and I remember when I used to be discharged, they would say, see you later. They'd always say, see you later, because they knew that I was coming back. I was told that I was a revolving door patient. On one of my PQ admissions, they tried to get me sent to a 10-year medium secure ward. Obviously being autistic, a lot of autistic people get stuck in hospital, and they decided that there was no hope. I ended up on a PQ for 5 months. They were like, no, we're going to send you to a medium secure. It'll be minimum 10 years. See you later. You're a lost cause. You're never going to achieve. You're never going to do anything. And I think for so long, that message was I am a failure. And obviously I was told during a lot of childhood abuse and stuff, and all of those things, and I had such a negative self-image and such a negative view of the world as well. I think I had that existential depression and crisis was very big, and I think I had, and now obviously I know that it's complex PTSD, that thing of I just felt the world was so evil, so how can I stay in this planet that's just so disgusting and horrible? And I think even when my life got a bit better, I would think oh my gosh, but there is so much pain. And obviously when you've been in a situation where you've been trapped and been hurt by people in positions of power especially, and you felt that pain, you've been screaming out for help and nobody comes, you could empathise with the other people in the world who are struggling and who are so trapped. And that was just something that for so long ate me up. I couldn't fathom how I could live in a planet like that. And even when things got better for me, and actually it was probably when things got better for me that I realised, because when I was living in those moments, it was survive. So I was I can't do this, I really can't. And then I was if I'm going to have to stay alive, I'm going to make a change. And so to begin with, that was the only reason I agreed to live. And that's how I got out of hospital and how I started, and that's when I joined Mind. And it was that activism was my therapy. It was that thing of right, I'm not living for myself, I'm living for the little versions of me, the other people in the world. And obviously, people say you need to live for yourself, and I have come from the mindset personally that live for whatever makes you live. And for me, to begin with, it was living for doing that. And then through that came the, not revenge, we won't use that word, but that thing of okay, you've told me, and everyone told me I'd never do it. I literally, my psychiatrist, when he rang me yesterday, he went, so did you get to London? Oh, I've been living here 6 months, my friend. Actually, I did do it. And, then he takes all the credit, and you're sorry, mate, don't know who you think you are, get out. But that thing of okay, and so those negative, for me, those people say to, I don't know, can you use that? But those negative messages that I had and that played in my head over and over again, and even where I was living just before I moved to London, there was it was like walking on eggshells, and like that thing of this, it was a specific person in my family, and, you know, did make my life an absolute living whatever, even, you know, that was different to the original childhood trauma, because, you know, we have lots of things going on. And for so long I let those words eat me up, and then I was like, you know what, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to take the photos and you can look at them, because like, and that became my thing of like, prove them wrong. And like that bit of, I suppose it's not, is it a bit of advice that I was given? Not really. Well, the Pinterest boards, that's where all my quotes, I have like profound quotes are my favourite thing ever. And I was like, and that's that thing of like when I have tricky times, you know, like the other week, like New Year's is a particularly hard time. I had to write a whole poem about New Year, because January was always my worst month. And, you know, when I'm having those moments and I'm like, oh my goodness, I feel completely alone, I feel like I've got to battle this whole world by myself, you know, I go through my little quotes and I have a look and I think, you know, you're doing this, and obviously luckily I will just state, you know, for the camera that I do actually have other reasons to live now. I have good things in my life, you know, please no one section me, but actually I look and I think that's why you're doing this, because although it was horrible and no one deserves and all of those other, you know, things, you can make just that tiny bit of difference, that tiny bit of change. And I think over this past year specifically, where I've really made that the biggest progress in finding out who I am and like understanding myself, there's a few little comments that I've had that have made me realise why I do what I do. Yeah, definitely. Because I wrote a whole poem. It's called. It's the one. I don't know whether you guys got it at local minds. There was a poetry book published by National Mind, and my poem's called. What is it called? No, New Beginnings. Is that what they call healing? And that was written this time last year in January, because January was always the trickiest month. I always relapsed in January. Was always hospitalised in January. And last year, so 2024 was my first January I didn't end up in hospital and didn't have any attempts on my life. And actually I did the whole of 2024 without any suicide attempts, which was the biggest thing, which sounds like the most ridiculous like achievement ever probably to like, but it was huge for someone who I'd not done that since I was 9 years old, and it was massive. And I was like, that poem, like I do write a lot of poetry now, but that poem was just like and I was obviously got it, my first ever little published thing, obviously it's only within mine, but it was like, yeah, and I think January can be such a hard month for so many reasons, you know, with Christmas, the holiday season, and there's just so many different narratives like around whether new year, new me, it being a fresh start, and obviously there's like positives and negatives of both sides. And I think what I kind of came to this year was actually, it's all a social construct. And I think that I get a bit hung up on social constructs, the thing of life, but actually within that means that you can take the power either way. So like, if you want to do a whole new year reset, go for it. Like there is nothing wrong with doing that. If some people, like sometimes you want a fresh start, you want to start again, perfect. But all equally, if you don't, you also don't have to. And I think that thing of like, it can be in this world where we go into these trends where it's like either, oh, it's all the new year, new me, and you know, the body talk and all of this like stuff that can be really harmful, or we can go into the whole other side where we're like, no, we're not allowed to be a new year, we're all going to be the same person again. And actually, they're all quite extreme. I mean, I'm meant to be the autistic one, you know, on the extremes of like black and white thinking, but actually it's all a social construct, so you can decide. And actually I saw that quote on Christmas Day, I think it was on Christmas Day, and like, see, Christmas is a tricky time for trauma survivors, and it was something like, obviously not the religious aspect, so not talking about religion, but in terms of like the Christmas holidays as a like a, what is it? Well, I'm going to say capitalist construct, but I suppose it kind of is. That part, not the religious part. Just to very much clarify, don't get into religion. Like that is all a construct. Like how, you know, whether you have your Christmas lunch, like how you, all these things of like, you know, and I realised, because obviously a lot of people talk about that pressure at Christmas, and like, actually it is a construct. So if you know, if you want to sit there and I don't know, just watch Netflix all day and eat Indian, like that's not you failing at Christmas, because who said that you have to have a roast dinner at 3 p.m? Like no, like that's not actually a thing. So I think that's a mindset I'm really taking into this year. Like last year I had one intention, if we're gonna, you know, whatever anyone wants to call it, and that was not to kill myself, you know, basic, no suicide attempts all year, tick. this year is to be authentically myself, and within that is just like, and obviously, you know, it's not going to be, still going to have those moments where you're like, but actually I can be myself. And that does sometimes mean, I think that's something else, because I feel like there's all these narratives around like mental health, and it's like, oh no, just fully be yourself. That means you can't fall into any of like society's things. Yeah, you can. Like, obviously, it's about being like, I think that's the thing that's so confusing around like, for you, especially for young people. It's like all these messages, you're like, what am I actually meant to be doing? Like, and I think like there are social constructs that I follow, like obviously wearing, like this is really, welcome to Hannah's brain, like wearing clothes. I wear clothes. That is obviously a social construct. I am not going to stop wearing clothes because I like wearing clothes for many reasons. I enjoy fashion. I also, you know, do personally believe that we should be clothed in public. That's just, you know, that's just a thing, in my opinion, you know. So I do follow that social construct. So like saying that I'm, you know, that doesn't mean you're going to then just decide to like you can have a happy medium of both. And I think there's definitely, especially like within like the activism world and like having been in a youth voice, that thing of like, oh, do I sometimes, do I shop all organically? No, I've got an eating disorder, like I've got ARFID, like I barely, you know, and I'm also celiac, so it's really hard. I can't afford to do this. And I do as much as I can, but we can't be perfect. And I think that thing of like, that's really hard, because I think when you look in the media and the way that we hold up celebrities and people to this imperfect like standard of like what we expect people to be, and it's like, they are human, obviously, and there is a line. Can we just clarify? There's very much a line of legal stuff, like, you know, then we stop there. But I think that narrative also very much feeds into that thing of, you know, when you go into other aspects of life, is when you take people in positions of power or celebrities and you take away their humanness, obviously, first of all, it sets them up for massive failure, but also on the other side of that, it gives, you know, we're not going to get political, but it gives that, you know, narrative that these are somehow not human, and actually we are all human. That's the thing, that we all kind of are flawed. And actually, you know what, like obviously, again, you know, there's lines within that, like illegal activity, no. But, you know, when we just have this so much expectation, I think there's just so much expectation, but then sometimes within that, when you're like, oh, stop all the expectation, then there's actually pressure within the not doing the expectation, because it's almost like, you know, the whole like being a vegan, like that can be like, oh my gosh, I've got to be all this perfect thing. And I think obviously in an ideal world, maybe we'd all, but actually if you do as much as you can, that's all you can ever ask for. And I think that's a mindset that I'm hoping I'm going to continue into the rest of 2025, but has a mindset that like has helped my mental health, because I think it's exhausting striving for like, because you're being pulled in about 48,000 directions. The trends are going to keep changing. You're never going to be able to keep up, and actually it just leaves you in this like state of just feeling completely inadequate all of the time. I think as a parent, the first thing I would want to say to a parent would be, you're doing like an amazing job, and like hold on to the fact that this is a really, really hard thing to navigate. And actually, you know, not only do parents not get the rule book like to begin with of like how to be a parent. I mean, I'm not ever going to be a parent. I just can't. But like, you know, to add in mental health or mental illness is so hard. And like, that is such a challenge. I think that, you know, there's so much to be said about like not feeling guilty, not blaming yourself, all of those things. And obviously like it's a very nuanced situation. I think there are many things, this is the most autistic answer ever, because I'm thinking of all the specific situations, but I'm thinking of like my own mum, and like what would she say to a parent like of who's going through what? Oh, I know exactly what she'd say. It's come to me in a vision. As a parent, you want to problem solve, you want to make it better for your child, which is totally like a completely understandable and normal response. And actually, this almost certainly is a situation that you can't make better, that you can't problem solve. And not only by trying to drive yourself a bit crazy. I think my mum was like, she nearly made herself poorly trying to like understand the non-understandable. And I think actually she would say that the biggest thing that helped her was to, obviously it's hurt so badly that, you know, your child is in pain, and like that's goes against your any like natural instinct, but if to be able to just sit with them and to, you know, kind of, she had a phrase which she called, you know, stay on the lilo, and that was that thing of like, if you fall into the water, into the drown with them, they're going to pull you down, because, you know, if you're drowning and you're all flailing, you're all going to go down. Whereas the biggest thing that she could do was if she stays on the lilo and just reminds me that she's there, and that when I'm ready to get on, she's there and I can join her. And actually, by jumping into the sea with me was only going to make it worse. That's probably, the woman loves an analogy. So she made everything into an analogy. There's also all the burning building analogy as well, of like, you're on the outside, your child's at the top on the roof, like they've got to jump and it's gonna hurt to jump, and that's like, as the young person, it feels so scary to jump, because it's like, you know, the pain of jumping, but once you get to the other side, like it will be better, and staying in the burning building isn't going to work. But she'd have that thing of like her being on the outside. If she runs through the front door, she's not going to get to me because I'm at the top, and she's only, you know what's going to happen, let's be real, it's a fire. So actually, by waiting and just being there, but not getting inside the chaos of like the thing, and I think I don't know if that makes any sense, but maybe people who are going through it, hopefully that might resonate, that thing of, and it's not about not being there, you know, she would still be there, and she'd still be talking to me, and she'd still be reassuring, and she'd still be just almost, I don't want to swear, but she had very much afraid of sitting in the rubbish with me, but not buying into it, but like, it's still validating. I think that thing of like, the invalidation can be so traumatizing for like a young person, but that thing of like, not falling into the illness crisis part, because if everybody's running around screaming like a headless chicken, we're not going anywhere, so we're going to get worse.